So first we have Robert Barbetti. He's a global head of executive compensation and benefits at JP Morgan. And then we have Graham Brown, a partner at Lerer Hippeau. So first, Robert.
Well, it's interesting. The group that I sit in within JP Morgan is terrific because I don't have to sell anything. It's called the Advice Lab. It's been around for quite a while. It's a heritage JP Morgan group. We're a group of tax lawyers. Believe it or not, we do have a good time. With some very smart analysts and associates to do the real work. And I spend time both in the private bank as well as in the investment bank. So I'm working with the IB with IPOs, buyouts, M&A transactions. As a tax lawyer, I even lecture at NYU in the LLM program here in New York. So with that, maybe I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Robert. So Graham Brown, I'm a partner at Lerer Hippeau. We're a New York-based venture firm focused entirely on the very early stage of a company's life. So we define that as seed funding, and we're typically the first or one of the first institutional partners. We're one of the most active seed investors in the country. We do focus on New York. About 2/3 of our investments are here. And we invest across stages, so we're across categories. We're fairly category agnostic, and core areas for us include direct-to-consumer brands and e-commerce, enterprise software, marketplaces, consumer social, and then some emerging tech as well. But we're sort of come in and built to help companies go from that early seed foundational stage of 5 or so employees to 10 to 15 and raising a Series A and then supporting them beyond.
Great, thank you. So we had some questions that were submitted over the week. So we're going to start off with the earliest stage. So Graham, can you just dive into some of the common terms that startups need to understand when thinking about equity and compensation? For example, cap tables or options. Those are some things that I think are top of mind for this group.
So yeah, just covering the basics. So cap table, very simply, it's a ledger of who owns what in your company. It starts out very simply and gets more and more complicated as you raise additional rounds of capital, bring in different structures. You're going to have common and preferred will be the two most common. And then the key that you mentioned earlier is the options and the option pool. And that's how you're attracting talent to hire and retaining talent as well. So clearly core piece of the business. And I think the third really important term around this is vesting. And that's, you're giving people equity grants for the assumption that they're going to stick with you for a long time, and you stage those out over typically a 4-year period. I think we'll probably talk about that later. But those are kind of the crucial parts around equity and equity grants.
Great. And are there different types of startup equity?
Right. The different types of equity, I'll tell you, predominantly you see options, obviously, incentive stock options. You have non-qualified options. You have a restricted stock units, and it's really phantom. So upon the conversion of the unit to stock, that's when the taxable event occurs. Then, of course, there's restricted stock, which may not be the best, because when it vests, it's taxable. Nobody has the money to pay the taxes. If you turn around and do what they call an 83B election on the stock, you're paying tax immediately, but the downside is if you're not there at the moment of vesting, you lose it and you pay the tax. And if the stock goes down, you can't declare a loss on your return. But these are predominantly, if you do transition into either purchased by a public company or you go IPO, that's when compensation changes perhaps 180 degrees. And then you get performance measurements in, like performance share units is a typical one that you'll see. Upon the metrics being satisfied, you can either get stock, cash, or a combination of both. But it's a good golden handcuff. I might just say, since we're talking about equity, and jump ahead a little bit from maybe some of the questions I may ask, if you have a plan, there's ISOs granted, which most likely they're going to be, have an early exercise provision in the plan. I mean, I'm going to tell you things that are pitfalls that people have run into, which I think are important for you so you don't do the same trip. In San Francisco, I have a medical device company that now has a value as private, $60 a share. The shares were granted, incentive stock options, but the incentive stock options were granted less than $1. The value of the company is $60, and the co-founder cannot afford to exercise the option because the spread on that is actually subject to the alternative minimum tax, which is a tax that can be devastating. As a result, how do you get that out of that problem? So what I recommended is to let the options expire, because if you did something else, you're going to be involved in a tender offer. And then the whole idea is then I would take the spread on the option, convert it to restricted stock units, grant them, put a time vest on it, because they want to certainly keep the person there. So it helps somewhat of the remedy, but it's a big pitfall unless you have the early exercise. Early exercise means upon the grant, I exercise it. Now, I have underlying shares that still have the same vesting requirement. I make an 83B election on the shares. That starts the capital gain clock running right there. And I'm not out of pocket. And it's a way for the employees to get a hold of something where they really don't have the money. Remember, the non-qualified options are going to be subject to ordinary income tax. And then the last provision I'll mention with respect to those options, because these are very typical. A lot of times you can only grant ISOs up to $100,000 of fair market value in 1 year. So usually you don't get the 409A valuation exact, so that it's topped off with non-qualified options. When you do that, make sure, and a lot of people forget, and a lot of law firms forget, put an intra-family transferability provision in. This allows the options to be gifted to a trust for your children or family members. And remember, this is a real discount, because the operative thing for estate planning are discounts. The reason it's non-marketable. So now I have a discounted option. I can move to a trust, or I could get a double discount by moving it to a family limited partnership and putting the units. But this is all stuff that can be scaled back. But these are wonderful opportunities and wonderful planning that doesn't cost anything. And those are the operative words, don't cost anything, that you should take advantage of.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Sounds like you'll need a lawyer to dive into some of those terms.
Or you can call me.
And
Good advice.
what kind of pitfalls should they think about with respect to the cap tables? Like when you're, hiring people, you're getting investors. I think let's keep that in mind. As before that, and as part of the cap table, how should they also think about advisors or board members? Like, what are the types of things you should think about when giving away equity and creating a cap table?
Yeah, so I guess one thing I'd say to avoid pitfalls is to really be cautious and protective of your cap table. I think a lot of founders, particularly at the beginning when they own a lot of their company, will give grants and undervalue what their equity is worth, whether it's to advisors, whether it's to part-time service providers, whether it's to their early employees. And it's easy at the beginning because you own so much, but over time that starts to really, really dilute you, particularly as you think about further rounds of capital. And so I guess just to avoid pitfalls, I would always be very cautious in making sure you're tying those options to the value that you expect to get from them, whether it's with an employee or a board member or an advisor. In terms of a board member, at the early stage, we typically see a range for an independent anywhere from 25 basis points to a percentage. And I'd say for advisors, you're looking sub 25 basis points would be high. And so I think the key with those, you're probably gonna have a slightly longer vesting period with a board member who you'd expect to be with you over 3 or 4 years. Advisors, the key is tying them to very specific goals that you're trying to achieve over a set period of time and having those options vest over that set period of time, so that you're fully aligned with what it is that you want, whether it's helping you secure your first 2, 3, 4 customers, whether it's partnerships, whether it's help on, branding and positioning, whatever it is. I think it's being very specific and strategic about aligning the time period and the duration with the amount of options that you're giving them, and with as specific of ROI as you can get.
Remember, it can only be non-qualified options. Unless you're a full-time employee, that's the only time you can get a grant of incentive stock options.
Okay, great. And so we're talking about options and sort of equity amounts, but what do those percentages mean? How do you even value a company that's pre-revenue? How do you know my company's worth $10 million? How do you get those numbers?
So yeah.
Go ahead, and I'll add on to it.
There's a few ways. At the earliest stage, there's two values, right? You raise your first round of capital, and you got a value put on the company. Now that's not where you're going to be issuing options, but that is a line that you can point to as what your company is worth. And it's actually a good way to think about how you. This is a little further along, but thinking about that value of your last round and how you compensate people going forward, as it allows you to take a percentage value and put it into a dollar value. So if you know you want to give someone $100,000 and their option grant should be a certain percentage of that dollar value, you can really think about that once you have a value on your company and figure out a way to repeatably give out very specific option grants that align with a strategic plan. At the earlier stage, it's very much more art than science. And so those first 10 hires, they're all going to look a little bit different. They're going to be much higher than you expect when you're post-Series A. And you're going to be granting them all at a 409A, which you'll do probably after your first round of financing. It'll be valuing the common stock that you hold. You can use someone like a Carta. You can use any independent third-party firm to do it. If you're really, really small and have no money, no revenue, never raised outside capital, you can basically get it done for free if you want to give option grants away before that. But typically, we think about it coming right around that first fundraising round. You pay whatever it is, $5,000 or less for a 409A, and that gives you a value on your common stock and what you can use for your strike price.
Most important thing I would say is remember that valuation is so important under 409A. I rarely see audits, but you know what? I see them when it's respect to 409A. Because some people like to use the previous year's valuation, and they've done a round, and they unfortunately want to use that last year's valuation to do a strike price. That's the thing the service is going to pick up the most, because it's the 409A valuation that can be, misinterpreted or an old value used and so forth. But I ditto everything, because at the very beginning, you're trying to endear people to join you that are important people to you in the organization, and they're taking a chance. So what do you need to do? You need to give them a little bit more equity so that they're going to be enjoying the same kind of, enthusiasm that you do for the startup. So I think at the beginning, give a little bit more, and then perfect number 12 or 15. After that, then it gets ratcheted down.
Yeah.
And so now let's think a little bit about compensation. So Robert, how should founders compensate themselves, and what about the earliest employees?
All right, founders, believe it or not, I really am an advocate of founders getting paid. And I'll tell you, I've seen too many situations. And I'll tell you, because their job as a founder is one thing, but it's a different job when they serve as the CEO, and they're working very hard. And with respect to that, the market, if they don't see you getting paid, eventually, I'll tell you the common comments that I hear. They said, well, what the hell is he or she doing? They're not getting paid. Are they really working, and is there real value to them? They think maybe another officer within the company if they put themselves as an executive chairman or a chairman. So I believe in providing equity. And this may be an appropriate time to say this as well. With a young startup company, the thing that you should think about, which is invaluable, and believe it or not, a lot of people don't realize it, is called qualified small business stock. And it's an exemption if you have $50 million in value or less. It's a SCorp. Remember, a SCorp, not an LLC. And so consequently, if it's a SCorp, and founders especially with stock, and if getting and induce people at the very beginning to participate in the company, give them stock, because if you hold the stock for 5 years and there's a transition event, you get $10 million exempt from taxation. Coincidentally, New York is a great state for that because they give you the 10 million exemption on a state level where California doesn't. And the federal level, you get $10 million. And I'm going to tell you what I did a transaction just a couple of months ago. Mom and Pop got 10 million. I put shares for each of the 3 children. And as soon as before we sold, I had the trust irrevocable, which means it looked like a separate human being. It has a separate ID number. Each kid got $10 million. So now you got a situation where you had $40 million exempt from tax. If you're an LLC, you can do a tax-free exchange for the units for shares, and you're there. And the last thing I'll say, I had a SCorp recently, and they switched to an SCorp. Then they switched back to a SCorp. So the question of the day came up, do those shares qualify for QSBS originally granted? The answer is yes, because the majority of the time it stayed as SCorp, even though it transferred. So these are kind of the nuances. And the last thing I'll say about this, people that are founders, here's the beauty of it. I can take those shares, and even before I hold them for 5 days, I can roll them over to another SCorp after they're sold free of tax. So it's a way of continuing to jumpstart new businesses. I can use this name because I just met with them too, Glaukos, which is a company we did an IPO for. They didn't even know they had QSBS. And that serial entrepreneur is just doing that, selling. So the initial shares of what you provide for the initial people that work for you it's really important if it qualifies for the QSBS. By the way, this law is back from '93. It's 50% QSBS, 50% of 10 million, and I think 2010 it jumped to 75%. Now it's one of the provisions that are in the tax code permanently.
One that we think about a lot too as investors. And so when you see a lot of seed rounds, maybe on safe notes or maybe a convertible notes, for us, the QSBS time doesn't start ticking until we own equity. And so there's certain situations and reasons why you might want to do a convertible note. For us as seed investors, we're effectively pricing 100% of our rounds. So that the day when we get involved with the company is the day that time starts ticking.
And by the way, if you have that early exercise provision for the incentive stock options I told you, you grant it, you exercise it. As soon as you make the 83B election, even though you're not vested in the shares, it counts towards ownership of the 5 years for QSBS. That's another subtlety, which is kind of interesting. So important to focus on it.
Great. And so, when a startup is making some of their key hires and there's various positions, what kinds of ranges of equity are appropriate, based on the stage of company? If you're joining a new startup, what can you potentially expect as far as maybe percentages of ownership in a company?
Yeah, so if you're among those first 10 employees and you're a critical business hire, you're usually looking in percentage points. And so percentage points. And the difference is going to be once you're really past Series A and a little bit larger, you're looking in basis points for the most part. And so first 10 employees, again, these are assuming that you are a critical role to the business success, whether you're a developer or you're on the marketing side or you're sales. Usually it's somewhere between 1 to 2.5 percentage points. If you are joining a team of 2 co-founders and neither are technical and you're technical and you're going to be their CTO, you might see a situation where it's 5 or 6%. And so the way we think about it as investors, when we come in and lead a seed round, we're typically reserving an option pool of around anywhere from 10 to 20%. I'd say typically right around 15. And we think about that as the hiring needs between when we invest in the Series A. And the Series A typically comes somewhere between 12 to 18 months afterwards. And so all those hires that are coming in that period, we're thinking we should be allocating roughly 15% of the company to those new employees.
I happen to see really very similar percentages, 1 to 2%. These are not things that are off the radar. Usually people talk about it and think about it in best practices. So I really do see probably the same thing. I always see a reserve, though, of options because as you start to speed up towards the IPO, you don't want to be overly diluted. But on the other hand, what you do want to do is have the options available without having back to the board. If I was public, I'd have an evergreen provision in it to make sure you don't have to run back to the board all the time, with 3 to 5% to take care of it. But on the other hand, when you're growing fast, you may be giving grants out, every round. So you have to review the option program, at that particular time.
So you touched on dilution, and that's actually a question that has come up a lot in Slido. So is there a way as a new employee to somehow get stock or options that are not dilutive, or to sort of maintain your ownership? I had worked at a couple of startups and certainly did not have that, but curious if there are ways that employees can.
I have to tell you, I take a look at provisions that would be similar to what you would see in an employment agreement. Now, at the startup, you may not have it, but I always look to the plan document too, because these things should be covered. What happens, and this goes to dilution, what happens upon death, disability? What happens on separation without cause? What happens to separation for good reason, change of control provisions, non-compete provisions? All those things should be handled someplace, either in your documents or in an employment agreement. Very seldom have I ever seen a situation in which they're going to be protected from dilution. I worked on an employment agreement for somebody, and it was with respect to a German company that he's working for, and I did get that provision in. I told him you should frame it, light it, and show it, because it rarely ever happens. But things you should be thinking about would be repurchase things too, repurchase agreements, because, no offense, but when private equity, so I'll make them the bad guy. So when private equity comes in, oftentimes you got to look at that contract. I just worked on one in which the CEO was let go, was not the appropriate person to take the company public. Looked at the contract, repurchase of the shares, back to the initial value, which was peanuts. So all the appreciation they lost. So things need to be looked at carefully, is my advice. But I deal with dilution, and it always comes down to this: who do you really want to be with the company? I don't give options, because usually by that time the strike price is too high. But I do give restricted stock units out. And with those units, I do pre to post, pre to IPO to post IPO. I put a time based on it, and that makes up the dilution, because now I don't have to deal with the high strike price.
Yeah, there's no way around dilution, and if the company's doing well, the dilution should be a positive thing, in that you own slightly less of what is a much larger and more valuable company. And I think the way that sort of we advise, and a lot of our founders who have, I think, really strong retention and plans in place, are and as you get later and later on, I think more of your option pool is shifted to retention versus hiring new talent. There's sort of three ways. One is within promotions. When you promote someone to a new role, you up their options to where that new role would be. The other is for star performers. So there's sort of 10, maybe top 15% of your employees, you give them grants based on a certain percentage of the base that you gave them originally. And then there's sort of more of an evergreen mentality, where 2.5 years in, when somebody's a little over halfway vested with their full share grant, you start then issuing new grants that are roughly a quarter of that original amount, and you do those on a yearly basis. And that gives sort of a continuous stack, effectively, of vesting equity, such that there's never that cliff moment where an employee says, I'm fully vested, I have to start all over again, I might as well, this is when I should pick my head up and look at other roles. And so there's a few ways that in a company you'll kind of counter dilution, but I've never seen anything in any of our companies, and it wouldn't make sense, where employees are protected against dilution, such that any time a new investment comes, they're re-upped.
Yeah, I think the most important thing he said was retention. And remember, stop and think some of the private companies right now that are huge, and how long the employees have had to deal with restricted stock units. Because a lot of times you'll see a double vest. RSUs would be more for the rank and file, and now more and more for the larger companies as well. Don't forget this QSBS, and I'm telling you, the reason I say that is even Uber has QSBS shares if you dig down. So that's an important thing to think about. But with retention, a lot of times upon the exercise of an option, like for example, there may be an additional holding period of a year or two so that not everybody sells at the same time when it does have enough. Facebook, for example, granted ISOs and then RSUs with the double vest. As I said, the RSUs vested, but the taxable event didn't occur until after the lockup period. But what they didn't figure out is that everybody was not only going to sell stock attributable to the withholding, but the rest of the stock as well. So that's something why you think about an underlying hold for retention so they don't grab all the money after the lockup period and run. So that holding period is important. One thing, maybe it's not appropriate at this time, but I don't want to forget and mention it. A lot of times there's stock or options that people have exercised and they want to sell the underlying stock to a third party. You got to look at the documents. I had one person come in. I had to give her a stiff drink because she had exercised all of her ISOs, no early exercise. She had a $19 million tax liability. The problem is, if she sold any shares, she had to leave the company. That was one of the provisions of Facebook. So the only way she could get out of it is do a disqualifying disposition, sell some of the underlying shares, create the ordinary income to get rid of the alternative minimum tax. So who are you going to sell it to? So you have a third party, but at the time the valuation of Facebook was $20, they were going to give her 22. Only the $20 is subject to capital gains. That $2 extra she gets is ordinary income. So if you do ever have a third party, think about the tax ramifications.
Okay, we have a question with respect to vesting, and someone was asked about a reverse vest. Can you talk about maybe first what are some common vesting schedules? I think we all know about a 4-year. Are there others, and what is a reverse vest?
Well, I'll just throw it quick. Frankly, a vesting that I see most of the time, and probably you have 25%, then it's on a monthly basis up to 4 years. That's pretty much the standard, I'll say. There's always variations on that theme. A reverse vest is, I will see that if a founder gives another person founder shares and brings them on, but how do you know they're not going to quit and take the shares with them, and now you got a non-employee owning the shares? So what you do is you put a reverse vest on it, so over time the shares begin to drop and become yours, and it'll decline, so I may start off with, 100 and let's just ratchet it down over time so that if they do leave, they're not going to take the shares with them. Is that the typical thing you see?
Yeah, and the most common one we see is it's 4-year vesting with a 1-year cliff at the beginning. And then you start vesting monthly. And that's what we have in our term sheets. In the reverse, as far as I understand it, gets you to a similar place. It's just a slightly different structure.
Okay, great. And so if everyone's submitting on Slido, I think we probably will take some questions on this, but also feel free to raise your hands if there's anything in particular you'd like addressed. So we'll start with you. So this is a question around a change of control clause with a stock option grant.
You mean whether you should have it or not?
Yeah, because I'm hearing that it could create some problem in an M&A situation.
Well, I'll tell you what they're usually referring to when you say that question is going to be 280G. 280G, for me, is an excise tax provision, and I'll tell you what it means, but interestingly enough, it really applies to private companies as well as public companies. So what it does is they take a look at your compensation 5 years from the date of the transition event. They look at your W-2 compensation, they multiply it by 3. If as a result of accelerated options, for example, and the time value is measured as well, you're $1 over 3 times. So let's say I made $100,000 a year, $300,000 is my limit, and what I'm getting because of the acceleration of the awards is $1 more. everything is subject to a 20% excise tax if it's a public company, except for 1 years of compensation. Now, that's public. Now, let's say a private company. So you have my VC partner over here, and he's not that crazy about the management, and how they're doing it. And so, as a result, the question is, there is going to be an acceleration, and they are going to get over this 3 times hurdle rate. Do they automatically get it? No. The people who are not subject to receiving it have to vote. There has to be 75% vote that they are actually going to approve the additional amount of money so it's not subject to the 20% excise tax. Now, they may say this VC group, it's not this VC group, but I do have a VC group that's really irritated. And so they're really afraid that they're going to lose this additional amount, but they could lose the whole amount. And so to protect at least the amount up to the 3 times level that I'm talking about, they have said, we won't be subject to a vote, and so forgive it. They'll forgive, and they won't take the additional amount. Now, if I have a public company and I'm running against these acceleration things, and say there's a severance plan in it, what I do is I redesign it, and I may put a non-compete in, so the money attributable to the severance plan is really characterized as a quid pro quo for the employment agreement, and that pulls money out of the transaction, because that money has nothing to do, the non-compete, with the transaction. Or I might have a consulting agreement so that it always reduces the amount below that 3 times. But I think that's what you're referring to, and if you're not, I'm sorry, but you have probably comments with respect to that?
Yeah, so the other comment I would have as it pertains to changing control, so the way we structure our investments is there's what's called a double trigger. And so if you're acquired, and then that's this 1 trigger, and then fired without cause, that's 2 triggers, all your options are accelerated. Now, there's also situations oftentimes that we'll negotiate with management where X% of unvested shares at the time of a change of control will accelerate, and then you'll still have some left over. But what we're thinking from our side and what we're concerned about is that negotiating with the buyer and the fact that they're buying the company in part because they want the core team involved, and if they buy the company and everyone vests 100%, they're going to have massive turnover and people are just going to leave with their money. And so that's sort of, in terms of change of control, what we think about at our stage, that's how we're thinking about it, and that's what we're putting in to make sure that the company is best set up for that, but also fair to the employees.
Yeah, and I'll tell you something, we just worked on a situation when I was asked that, and it's similar to what you're saying. There was acceleration for the senior management team, and some of them may be replaced because the CFO may be, or the GC, but the other people we were afraid were going to leave. So what I suggested is, for those options that weren't vested, we'll value them today, we'll bank them, and then consequently, you'll get paid over 2 years. The first year and the second year is a golden handcuff. So they know what the award's going to be. It's a handcuff out there. They know what the value is going to be, and it's a great retention tool.
So when you're a company starting out, there are a lot of accelerator and incubator programs out there, and it's great to get accepted, but you often have to give some equity as part of that. How would you think about, going into those programs, kind of cost benefit of that?
You're probably more familiar with that.
Yeah, so there's actually, it's worth reading. Paul Graham, who's one of the early founders of YC, has an interesting equation which basically results, it's a very simple equation, but it basically results in what's the value that you think you'll get out of that, that you'll get out of, in this case, that accelerator, and is it worth that much equity in your company? And so it's really tying the value, and this is how I think about anything you're doing, including hiring employees, tying the value that you think you'll get out of it to the amount of equity that you need to give up. And oftentimes it'll come with a small investment in as well. But really it's all about, you're going to give them this much of your company, how much is that worth to you and your business? And if it helps you, then it could, in many cases, it could absolutely be a great investment. I think the way that Paul calculated for YC in early days was something around the lines of it was, if they make a 6-point-something% improvement in your company over 3 months, then it's worth doing. And his argument was that if you look at our track record, which at the time had some pretty amazing companies, including Dropbox, it's worth your time. And so it really depends, and each company is different, and so it has to be somewhat personal, but there is kind of a baseline formula for thinking about, is this worth it for me? And then you have to make some assumptions around how much value that program will create for your company.
Okay, great. There was a few questions we had around kind of documentation and paperwork, and you certainly mentioned a lot of them. But when founders are getting started and making employees, what types of agreements do they need to make sure they have in place before they kind of divvy up any equity?
Well, I mean, you have to have an equity plan in place. One of the things I would always suggest, have everything in this equity plan, even if you don't think you're going to grant it. Because frankly, performance share units, RSUs, everything. And the reason why I say that is the last thing you want to think about is going public if you get that opportunity, and then you want something else in it, and you have to go back for a shareholder vote. So I like to see everything in the plan, and the grant documents specifically will spell out if the ISOs are early exercisable, for example, or transferable if they're non-qualified options, and so forth. And so the transferability provisions, years ago, I'm not going to go through the whole story, but we put transferability provisions in Microsoft. Microsoft ended up with $16 billion of underwater options. No more shares to give out. So we thought of a way for Ballmer not have vegetables thrown at him to go ahead and get his balance sheet up as much as we could. So I went to the SEC, got the options, stripped the forfeitability provisions, and we bought them. Then there was a shelf registration of 628 million shares. What we did is when it was selling, and this is all because the plan document allowed it. So ISS, the Institutional Shareholder Services, which will be the watchdog after a few years of being public, couldn't say anything, although they did, of course. But we ended up putting the shelf registration, selling, when the stock was going up and buying when it was going down. But here's the difference. I paid the people from money being paid to Microsoft and dropping it down, because now they got a tax deduction for something they never would have gotten a tax deduction for. So everybody was happy. But these are types of things you got to think about. So I use that as an example because all the transferability provisions I put the kitchen sink in, so they didn't have to go to anybody. All they had to do is go to the board and get approval. So that would probably be the most important documentation that I would think you would want, is the equity plan and have that down.
Okay, great. And then another question around, as a founder, when you have issues, how do you know when to go to your advisors versus when do you need to involve your board? And that's for you, Graham.
Well, I think the first thing is to go to the advice lab. And a lot of people do because it saves them a lot of time and money because they're educated enough in order to think through what they should be going to the advisor for and the attorney. You got to hire sophisticated people on your board, I think, especially on the comp committee and the audit committee.
Yeah, so all approvals will be going through the board.
Yeah.
And then anything that's like a CEO or a COO level grant will be a board decision as well. Mm-hmm. So, that's where you're starting. At our stage, boards are very small. It starts to become a little bit different when you're approaching a public company and you might have double-digit people around the table. But for us, it's usually 3 to 5 people.
What are the grant sizes that you're seeing for board members in equity?
So usually at our stage, it's pretty rare we'll bring in an independent board member.
Okay.
There are occasions where it's a very specific or unique industry where we have someone in our network that we think can be incredibly helpful for the team in navigating the different roadblocks that they may run into, whether it's a regulatory issue or otherwise. But most commonly, it's investors at our stage, right? So it's the preferred holders. So if we've done a Series A and a seed round, maybe you have someone represented from the seed, maybe you have someone represented from the Series A, then you have probably 2 common board seats or 2 management board seats, and then maybe you have your 5th, which is this independent, which you may then bring on. But that's usually not going to be until post the Series A.
It's great to have a VC, though, because besides the financing,
Yep.
they really know all the traps and they know the roadmap to get someplace. So it's really important to pick the right VC in order to do it.
And the right lawyers early.
Yes.
All this documentation stuff, if you have good lawyers, they should be giving you advice.
Right, absolutely.
And so, that begs a question around when you think about angel investing versus VC investors. And, when should a company, it sounds like there's some key benefits to potentially working with the VC.
Yep.
Why would you work, at what point are you looking for angels versus having kind of a real institutional investor?
Yeah, I mean, there's still great reasons to have, and I would say for a lot of our rounds, we'll include 2, 3, 4, 5 strategic angels as part of the syndicate. Because there are oftentimes individuals that can really help and really serve as advisors, and then you have them aligned with you from an equity perspective because they put money in, and that's an ideal situation versus granting them equity so that they help you, allow them to really buy in and be fully aligned with the team. I'd say the other situation, sometimes you want to just put together a really small friends and family round to get a proof of concept up and running.
Right.
A couple referenceable customers, a few data points that then you can go and raise a larger seed round. Now there's seeds kind of broken apart into pre-seed, seed, and then post-seed or expansion stage seed. So there's a lot that can happen within the seed world. But for us, we'll do anything as small as a $500,000 check, and we might do a $3 million check. And so it really depends on the dynamic of the round. But from a company standpoint, I think am I ready to talk to venture capitalists? Part of that's going to be your network, what you've done before, what your idea is, how it differentiated from the market it is. And oftentimes it's better to get a few $100,000 together among angels, make a couple hires, get a little more progress, and then go talk to VCs and raise something that's a bit larger. That's still pretty typical for what we see.
And I would ditto that. I think it's important, to have these angel investors that are real working with strategy with you, helping you and so forth, because that is the way that you get VCs interested, by having quality people and advisors around you. They know you've given a lot of thought to it. They put their money in it. And so that makes a big, I think, statement, at least that I've seen for the VCs.
Okay, great. So, we've been asking just a lot of pointed questions, but Graham, is there any kind of top considerations we haven't touched upon that startups need to think about with making equity distributions? And then Robert will ask you kind of a twist on that next.
Yeah, I think high level, the key decision is with co-founders at the beginning and what that looks like. We're not super dogmatic as investors as to what you have to do. I think the key is that you need to have given it real thought versus I think the easiest thing to do is say we're even co-founders and we're going to split it, without really putting thought into what that's going to mean and what that means, not necessarily today, but in 5 years from now and in 10 years from now, because this is a long journey. And what you sign up for today, you may feel very different about in 2 or 3 years. And so we've had situations where it has been even splits and things have worked out incredibly well. But by and large, we would prefer to see, if it's a 3-person team, one person who's the clear CEO, people have spent a lot of time thinking about the effort they're going to put in, who's going to be the real driver, who's going to be handling all the pitch meetings, et cetera, et cetera. There's one person that is going to have a larger ownership than the others. And there may be 3 different ownerships. And it's all built around a thoughtful analysis of, how involved and how much I'm going to drive this business to success. And so I think the most typical thing we see is a CEO who has the largest stake, and then 2, if it's 3 co-founders, 2 other co-founders who have some slightly smaller stake, depending on what their roles are going to be.
I really see very similar things, because frankly, the biggest arguments come around to the ownership and how they're going to split it up. And somebody's got to be the driver and be respected as that. And oftentimes you'll find a founder that's a CEO, they're maybe not the right business person to carry the business on. And so they got to recognize that and know when to step aside and have somebody else come in that has experience. I've given a talk in San Francisco to a whole group of professional CEOs. That's all they do. They come in and they take the public. At one point in time, they move it along. They know what to do and they know what to say. But to get that organized at the very beginning, I think it's really important, in the size of the grants, because then suddenly the issue of dilution comes in. If I hear dilution, it's like plastic to Mrs. Robinson. I hear that word constantly, about dilution. And so that's something that needs to be worked out ahead of time, because you want this to be smooth sailing. It's rough enough out there regardless. And so you want to make sure that you're doing things in a timely fashion, in an orderly fashion. I have a handout for you all that I think that may be helpful, because it's called Navigating Compensation from Pre to Post IPO. And it's got both planning from a corporate standpoint, from an individual standpoint, what happens as a checklist after you're IPO'd, and then it has the timeline for security filings and so forth. But it was done in a Q&A format by when I was interviewed by the NASDAQ. So it's memorialized. So it's a good thing just to take a look at your timeline as to what places you want to be on that timeline.
Great. And another question came in, which I think is pretty interesting, around, when you're starting a company, there's LLCs, there's SCorps, there's B Corps. Kind of, what should you think about starting, and what are the key distinctions?
Well, I think the C Corp is...
The C Corp, is the QSBS. And one other thing beside the QSBS is a magic word another one that I hear constantly now through the new tax law: opportunity zones. So an opportunity zone, Google it, and you'll find where all the locations are. When I looked at Houston, I know where all the politicians live. It's because they're not necessarily in poor areas. But look, startups can't be in the best areas. So we've had people that are investors that are really interested in certain companies as a good investment. But not only that, they're going to get a QSBS and they get the opportunity zones. Opportunity zones, I can take a capital gain, forego the tax on it, and then within 180 days, I invest in your company. So I hold it for 5 years, and I get 5 basis points checked off from the capital gains, and another 10% if it's 7 years, no tax after 10 years. So I have a VC actually in Nashville that worked with the company, and what they're doing is VC is going to be able to pick up the tax-free money because they work together, and they're going to have it held at the requisite period of time. But that's another thing that you should think about, because it could attract investors aside from the QSBS. That you don't need a C Corp for, the QSBS you do. And it's interesting, I always see LLCs in Texas. I never see C Corps. I saw 2 C Corps in my last trip. But a lot of them didn't even know about the QSBS. So there you go.
Yeah. When incorporating, if you're planning to raise from venture investors in the U.S., unless there's something unique, it's almost just a no-brainer to do a C Corp in Delaware.
Yep.
And so if you're an employee at a startup and equity is a part of your compensation, it seems like at some point maybe you need to be talking to a lawyer, an accountant, or what kind of resources do you think that they should really engage?
Probably a bank, so they can finance it. If they don't have any money, to exercise the option, that's where it's very difficult to get loans for non-public, equity. So as a result, where you need to go to an accountant is when you're exercising it. And you should think about, if you do have the funds as a privately held company to pay the strike price and the tax for a non-qualified option, then your consideration is, when should I be exercising the option? And if I've got a lot of money, I can say, well, I'll borrow it and pay for the strike and pay for the taxes and have that many more shares. But the point is, you got to believe in the company, you got to have this. So I think accounting is important, but you know what? A trust and estate lawyer for wealth transfer opportunities is really important too, because there you can take care of discounts and really provide for your family. And at the last moment, if you're going to have a taxable event, what do you need? You need a contribution to a donor advised fund for a tax deduction. That's one of the most valuable tax deductions out there, is charity, and that usually goes. But before a transition event occurs, You got to do that 9 months ahead. Otherwise, the service comes in what they call an assignment of income doctrine, and they'll think the transfer is a sham and they won't allow it. So you got to do it before the transaction, but don't forget a charitable contribution to reduce your taxes.
Okay, great. And we just had another question around the ownership percentages for co-founders. So when you start and as you raise rounds, how should they think about that?
So, yeah, I mean, I think that's back to that. Again, usually we like to see somebody who's the CEO, who owns the largest share of all the co-founders. We have plenty of situations that it's completely even, but I think that's usually the most aligned and
What does that mean
most
as far as the
attractive for us.
percentage of the company that they own?
Yeah. Well, so before we invest, oftentimes 100% of the company is owned by the founders. And so that could be, 25, 25, 50. It could be 25, 25, 25, 25. We have some companies that have 4 co-founders. And so it's just, it really depends. And then, I mean, thinking about dilution and going forward, if you're going to be on the VC journey and you think you're going to need a lot of capital raised maybe through a Series D, your 50% at that seed stage is probably going to be 10 to 15% at the Series D stage. That's just that's how costly it is to raise round after round of venture capital, which is why you see certain companies like Qualtrics, which are outliers, which became wildly profitable before needing to take on venture and were able to set terms and not sell that much of their company. But most companies that you see that get to this stage where they're public, the founders are generally owning less than 20%.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I agree.
So there's a lot more questions coming in, but you have an opportunity after, when we wrap up. We'll all stick around. So before we go, thank you, Rob. You mentioned having a handout for everyone. But what other tools or books would you recommend that the founders here should potentially kind of read to kind of better understand equity and for the startup employees how to think about taking equity?
So there's a ton of great resources.
Yep.
I think like the slides that Rob will provide. There's just a dearth of great information out there. Certain things that I think are really good. I think YC has some great content around this that you can use for an early stage founder. Fred Wilson's written some really, really insightful posts over the years. And while some of them, the actual numbers that plug in have changed quite a bit over the last few years, I think the general framework is incredibly insightful. And let's see, Paul Graham's is very good as well. Quora is a pretty useful source as well, just for user-generated content. And people are constantly asking about, what do I hire a VP of engineering when I've got 50 people? Like, what does that look like? What's the equity range I should give? That's all going to be on there. There's all good content. Once you've raised money, then you can lean on your VCs. So we have a person in-house who's recruiting and talent expert, and we have access to all the benchmark data, both from our portfolio companies, but also from other startups, and we can help frame any sort of equity grant or equity plan that our founders are looking to employ. So there's a ton of great free stuff out there, but then once you start fundraising, both your VCs and your counsel will have really good access to content and information.
Most of the time, people ask me, how much should I grant? What's the composition of the grant and so forth? So I will think of a peer group. I don't necessarily have to have the same industry, but I like to see what the revenue is, and I like to see the size of the company, the market cap. And so I can go to probably private companies very similar in those two arenas and come up with what would probably be a reasonable thing to think about. But another area you can look at will be the compensation consultants. They publish a lot. Towers Watson, Pay Governance, Frederick W. Cook. You look at that and they come up with statistics and numbers, educational material and so forth. For the tech companies, you may want to check Compensia. Compensia is a compensation consulting firm for which all the principals are former lawyers with Wilson Sonsini, which is one of the big, IPO companies out there, especially on the West Coast. And so oftentimes I'm on a panel with them, or I'll ask them to be on a panel. They have predominantly lawyers that are SEC trained and so forth. So that gives you a good flavor and background, so you can be much more educated about the whole process as well. But at any rate, you know, a lot of people can't afford a comp consultant, but so as a result, you know, they take a look at the materials and it still gives them enough to go forward with.
Great. And just one more thing while we're on the topic of resources. For founders, are there any sort of tools that you've seen for managing equity cap tables, some sort of software that you would recommend, or is it just kind of an Excel?
The Carta.
What's it called? Carta?
Carta's the big one right now.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to partner with them, I think. And basically, you know, this 409 evaluation is not a funny thing. It's important, right? So a stock and option administrator who's good will keep track of that. The last thing you want to do is keep your CFO or a bookkeeper busy, you know, with spreadsheets, trying to keep track of everything too. It will kill you and kill them as well.
All right, well, great. Thank you both so much, Robert and Graham. This was great. I hope everyone enjoyed.